January 8, 1943. Vitebsk region. Occupied Belarus. The night Anya Kovalenko ended up inside a Nazi camp did not begin with screams or barked orders. It began with silence, thick, almost tangible, the kind that splits a life cleanly in two. She was only 17 when the military truck carrying her and other civilians lost control on the frozen road. The vehicle slid over black ice that coated the asphalt like a false, treacherous skin. It skidded toward the ditch with a metallic shriek that tore through the darkness, then flipped violently onto its side. Everything dissolved into chaos. Twisted iron, muffled cries, the sharp reek of gasoline mixed with the biting cold of winter. Anya was thrown through the torn canvas of the truck. Her fragile body, already weakened by weeks of hunger and fear, hit the frozen ground with a dull, brutal impact that knocked the air from her lungs. For a brief moment, she hovered in that strange threshold between consciousness and nothingness. When she finally managed to open her eyes, still dazed, the first thing she saw was the floodlights. Ruthless beams of white light sliced through the night with geometric precision, casting perfect shadows across the barbed wire fencing the perimeter. Guard towers stood etched against the black sky. Shapes moved behind the fence, and in that instant, she understood. She had fallen onto the wrong side of the world. The soldiers saw her before she could sit up, before her mind could even grasp where she was, before the idea of running could exist. Boots thundered across the frozen snow. Orders in German cut through the icy air. Gloved hands, rough, impersonal, utterly devoid of mercy, dragged her across filthy snow stained with mud and fuel. A blow caught her in the ribs. A man shouted something she didn't understand, though the meaning was unmistakable. She had stopped being a person. She was now a problem to be dealt with. At that exact moment, when they shoved her through the metal gate of the lager and the floodlights pinned her beneath their cutting glare, Anya Kovalenko entered the first of the two hells she would have to survive. But fate, at times, draws paths as cruel as they are unexpected. 6 weeks later, reduced to little more than bones wrapped in translucent skin, burning with fever from typhus that was draining the last of her strength, sustained only by the stubborn decision to breathe one more day, Anya did the unthinkable. She escaped. She seized a moment of confusion during a nighttime guard change. A prisoner collapsing in the yard, shouted German commands, hurried footsteps. She crawled beneath rusted wires where the mud had given way. The barbs tore into her back. She didn't make a sound. When she reached the other side, she ran. She ran with shaking legs and bare feet against the frozen earth. She ran until her lungs burned like hot coals inside her chest. She ran until her strength gave out, until her muscles begged for mercy. She ran until the Belarusian forest swallowed her whole, and the world shrank to darkness, cold, and the uneven sound of her own breathing. She thought she was free. She thought she had left the worst behind. She thought nothing could be worse than what she had survived. She was wrong. That same dawn, barely 3 kilometers northwest of the camp, her body pushed past its limit and her fever blurring her vision, she collapsed in the middle of a partisan perimeter. Armed men and women, exhausted, starving, coated in mud and snow, who had spent months surviving in caves and makeshift trenches, surrounded her in silence. Rifles rose, held in hands trembling from cold and distrust. Their faces, hardened by war, scarred by deprivation, reflected a single emotion: lethal suspicion. And in one endless second, as she struggled to focus on those hostile expressions, Anya realized she had fled one death only to fall into the arms of another. What she could not imagine was that this encounter would leave deep scars on everyone involved, that it would alter destinies, save lives, and open the path to a struggle destined to echo far beyond the frozen forests of Belarus. Between February 1943 and May 1945, Anya Kovalenko did more than survive. She became a bridge between opposing realities, an observer and a fighter, a victim and someone who saved others. And when it was all over, when the roar of war finally gave way to silence, exactly 847 days had to pass before history, at last, spoke her name. If this story reached you somewhere deep inside, support it with a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters about those history tried to erase. If you want to go one step further, become a member and help us keep these voices alive. And if this video moved you, use the thanks button so this project can continue to grow. Now tell me, what city and country are you watching from? I want to know from where you're standing with the heroes the world left behind. In January 1943, the Vitebsk region was enduring one of the most ferocious periods of German occupation on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had shattered Soviet defenses 2 years earlier, and Belarus had become a devastated expanse of land. More than 3 million civilians had been killed, deported, or sent to forced labor. And since the invasion began in June 1941, concentration and transit camps functioned as merciless gears in a system designed to extract, exploit, and eliminate. These were not only places of mass extermination, they were factories of slavery, where prisoners were slowly extinguished day by day, victims of calculated hunger, cold that sank into the bones, and diseases that spread unchecked through overcrowded barracks. The number of forced laborers exceeded 400,000 across the occupied region, and mortality rates ranged from 18 to 35% per month, depending on the season and the Reich's production demands. This was not immediate genocide, but extermination by attrition, administered with scientific detachment and recorded with bureaucratic precision. Each death was a line in an accounting ledger. Each prisoner, a number erased from inventory. Yet beneath the surface of that organized terror, something else was happening. The Belarusian forests, vast and dense, dark even at midday during winter, had become a refuge for tens of thousands of partisans. Soviet soldiers cut off after the chaotic retreat of 1941. Peasants driven out after their villages were burned. Jews who had escaped ghettos and death convoys. German and Austrian deserters who no longer believed in the war. Fighters from occupied nations who chose death in resistance over life in submission. They were not regular armies with uniforms or clear hierarchies. They were small, poorly equipped groups, armed with stolen rifles and scarce ammunition, operating in total secrecy. They blew up railway bridges with improvised explosives, sabotaged supply trains on secondary routes, rescued prisoners from poorly guarded convoys, struck, and vanished into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. And they trusted no one. Because in the winter of 1943, in lands laid waste where the front line shifted week by week, the difference between ally and enemy was as blurred as the fog over frozen swamps. Anya Kovalenko was born in the autumn of 1925 in a small Jewish village called Kosienice, south of Warsaw, near the Vistula River. She was the youngest of 4 children, 2 older brothers, David and Samuel, and a sister named Rachel. Her father, Joseph, was a blacksmith and agricultural tool repairman, a man with large, calloused hands capable of shaping glowing metal with almost surgical precision. Her mother, Chava, was a respected seamstress in the village, known for her embroidery and for her ability to restore life to any garment, no matter how old or damaged. From her father, Anya inherited an analytical gaze the habit of studying objects, people, and situations as if searching for the hidden mechanism holding the surface together. From her mother, she inherited a meticulous patience, the kind that allows someone to spend hours on a single detail until it's exactly right. By the age of 14, she could read in 3 languages: Yiddish, the language of home; Polish, which she used at school and in the market; and some Russian, learned from a teacher who had once lived in the East. She was drawn to history books, especially biographies of people who had bent the course of events with their own hands. Old maps fascinated her too. The worn parchments where erased borders and vanished kingdoms still clung to existence. And she loved long conversations with her paternal grandfather, a man with a white beard and lively eyes, who told her about Jewish uprisings, forgotten resistances, moments when their people had chosen to fight rather than disappear. When the Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939, Anya Kovalenko was 14, and her world collapsed in a matter of weeks. Anti-Semitic laws came down like an avalanche: bans on attending school, confiscations, mandatory markings, curfews. Her family tried to flee east, toward Soviet territory, following the tide of refugees who believed safety might be found under the communist regime. They didn't make it. Roads were closed, borders sealed, checkpoints merciless. Her father, Joseph, was executed at a roadside checkpoint in October 1941. A German officer accused him of hiding a knife. It was his work tool, a blacksmith's knife, nothing more. But they shot him anyway, against the wall of an abandoned farmhouse. Anya watched from the truck where she waited with her mother and siblings. She saw him fall to his knees. She saw the shot. She saw his body collapse. She couldn't scream. Her mother's hand covered her mouth. "Silence," Chava whispered, "or they'll kill us all." Her mother and siblings were deported that December. They were separated at a railway station turned into a collection point. Men on one side, women and children on the other. Anya was classified as a young woman fit for labor and shoved away. Chava screamed her name. Anya tried to go back. A soldier struck her in the stomach with the butt of his rifle. When she finally caught her breath, her mother had already vanished inside a sealed cattle car. She never saw her again. Anya managed to hide for 3 weeks in the basement of an abandoned farm, surviving on rotten potatoes scavenged from a forgotten storage shed and rainwater collected in rusted cans. The cold was unbearable. The loneliness was worse. Every night she heard trucks passing on the nearby road, and every night she waited to be discovered. When it finally happened, 2 German soldiers inspecting the property for partisan hideouts dragged her out without ceremony and loaded her onto a military truck transporting civilians to a transit camp in the Vitebsk region. On January 8, 1943, that truck overturned on an icy curve, and Anya Kovalenko fell straight into hell. The camp she was sent to had no official name in German records. Documents identified it simply as Transit Facility OST-17, an administrative code stripped of emotion, stripped of humanity. Among prisoners who survived more than a month, it was known as Lager Ost, a place of passage and forced labor, run by Hauptmann Gerhard Falkenrath. Falkenrath was 38 years old, bald, gray-eyed, with a face locked in permanent boredom. He kept track of prisoners the way livestock is counted before slaughter. He wasn't a theatrical sadist who took pleasure in suffering. He was something worse. He was efficient. He counted calories with a pharmacist's precision. He timed work hours with a stopwatch. He calculated mortality rates with the detachment of an accountant reviewing quarterly reports. In his obsessively tidy office, he kept meticulous records: How many prisoners arrived each week? How many were still alive? How many were removed due to illness or exhaustion, a bureaucratic euphemism for death? And how many were transferred to other camps? Under his command, the camp functioned with industrial exactness. 14-hour workdays in sewing workshops, military laundries, and equipment repair units. Rations fixed at 600 calories a day, just enough to keep a body upright a little longer. A prisoner could remain functional for barely 3 months before severe malnutrition rendered them useless. Any infraction was paid for with collective punishment. If one person tried to escape, 10 others were executed. If stolen food was discovered, the entire barrack lost the next day's ration. The average mortality rate hovered at 23% per month, an efficiency considered acceptable by Reich standards. Anya Kovalenko was assigned to Barrack 9, the section for young women forced into sewing work. The building was long and narrow, thrown together from cheap wood and covered with metal sheets that let cold and rain seep through. Inside, triple-tier bunks lined the walls. There were no mattresses, only bare planks, and never enough blankets, so the women slept pressed against one another, sharing what little body heat they had. The smell was overwhelming. Sweat, urine, sickness, despair layered day after day. There she met Brina Aschenberg, a 16-year-old from Krakow, with enormous dark eyes that seemed too large for her wasted face and hands that never stopped trembling, a constant nervous vibration, as if her body were tuned to an invisible frequency. Brina had arrived 3 months earlier from the Krakow ghetto, after her entire family was eliminated during an action, another German euphemism. She had developed a simple, effective survival strategy: become invisible. She spoke only when necessary, worked with mechanical speed without lifting her eyes, and never looked guards in the face. When one approached, she lowered her head and shrank until she seemed like part of the furniture. At night, in the frozen silence of the barrack, when most women slept or cried softly, Brina whispered prayers in Yiddish so faint only Anya, who shared her bunk, could hear them. Fragments learned in childhood, words that no longer asked for salvation, but remembered that a world once existed where they had meaning. There was also Mirel Hofstadter, a 19-year-old Austrian with training in accounting, who before the war had worked for a respectable firm in Vienna. She was sharp, analytical, observant, gifted with that rare ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. While most focused solely on surviving the next day, Mirel spent weeks memorizing schedules, guard rotations, supply truck routes, arrival days for new prisoners, and those nearly imperceptible moments when vigilance softened. She didn't believe in miracles or divine intervention. She believed in patterns, in statistics, and in the human weakness that opens cracks in any system. Every system has failure points, she whispered to Anya the first night they shared a bunk. The Germans are organized, but that makes them predictable. When you find where the system breaks, you have to be ready to use it. And then there was Zelda Kurzbaum, 32, the oldest of them. A professional seamstress before the war, now forced to repair German uniforms in a workshop attached to the camp. Zelda was quiet, withdrawn, her face marked by a fatigue that went beyond the physical, the exhaustion of someone who has seen too much and no longer has the energy to be surprised by horror. But her hands were extraordinary. She could sew on a button in 3 seconds, mend a sleeve without a visible stitch, embroider insignia with flawless precision. The German officers respected her technical skill. She was useful, and in that inverted universe, usefulness equaled value. It granted her a minimal but real freedom, moving between the barrack and the workshop without constant escort, saving discarded fabric scraps, watching without raising suspicion. A freedom almost invisible, and one that would later prove absolutely crucial. Non-commissioned officer Konrad Reifenstahl was the guard who paid them the most attention. He was 29, with an angular face carved by hard lines, pale eyes cold as shards of ice, and a distinctive way of moving. Slow, deliberate, the gait of a predator fully aware that its prey has nowhere to run. Reifenstahl didn't shout. He didn't strike without visible cause. Unlike other guards who indulged in open sadism, he inspired terror precisely through his silence. During morning inspections, he walked between the lines with measured steps, studying them the way an entomologist examines insects beneath glass, scanning every face, every posture, searching for signs of weakness or, worse, thought. It was he who marked Anya Kovalenko as potentially dangerous from the very first day. Not because of her actions. She worked in silence like the rest, but because of her gaze. "That one has a mind," he told Falkenrath one afternoon as they reviewed barrack records in the administrative office. "You can see it in her eyes. She observes too much, thinks too much. She needs to be watched closely." For 6 weeks, Anya survived by sewing German uniforms 12 hours a day under artificial light that burned her vision. Her fingers bled constantly, needles piercing skin cracked by cold and malnutrition. Tears filled her eyes involuntarily from exhaustion. She lost 11 kilograms from a body that had already been thin when she arrived. In the 4th week, she contracted typhus, high fever, violent chills, delirium. She hid it, working with nearly 39 degrees of fever, trembling inside sweat-soaked clothes, clenching her teeth to keep from screaming when pain split her skull. Brina covered for her when she slumped for a moment over the work table, pretending she'd dropped something. Morel diverted guards with useless questions about sewing instructions. Zelda found thicker scraps of fabric to wrap Anya's lacerated hands, concealing wounds that could have marked her unfit for labor. Amid that daily hell, while death moved through the barracks each night carrying off the weakest, the 4 of them began to think about what they all knew was impossible: escape. The idea took shape one February night, when the outside temperature had dropped below -18 degrees and the barrack offered little relief. Morel whispered into the darkness, barely louder than the ragged breathing of dozens of exhausted women. "The guard on the east sector changes at 02:30. There are exactly 7 minutes with no surveillance on the northern perimeter while the relief shifts from the main tower." Zelda added, so softly her words felt like shared thought rather than speech. She knew the spot. She passed it when delivering uniforms to storage. The wire was rusted near the drainage ditch. Months of erosion had softened the mud. There was a gap. Brina, her voice shaking, asked what they would do afterward, because the forest was full of German patrols, and they would be hunted like animals. Anya answered in a hoarse voice, weakened by fever but unbroken. The forest. Yes, they would probably be killed. They might freeze to death or get lost, but if they died, at least they would die trying to live, and that was more than they would have if they stayed. They spent 3 weeks refining every detail. Morel memorized each guard's movements, mentally timing seconds and identifying variables that could ruin everything. Zelda stole a length of rusted wire to use as a cutting tool, hiding it beneath her clothes during transfers between workshops. Brina saved hard bread under her bunk, hoarding crumbs day after day to have some energy for the run. And Anya studied the terrain every time she stepped into the yard, memorizing the distance to the tree line and calculating how many seconds they would need to cross the open ground. They had no maps and no compass, no clothing fit for the cold outside, no guarantees of any kind. All they had was a 7-minute window, 4 pairs of trembling hands, and the absolute certainty that staying meant dying slowly, stripped of dignity, reduced to numbers in an accounting ledger. The night of February 19, 1943, everything went wrong and right at the same time. At 02:27, exactly 3 minutes before the guard change, as non-commissioned officer Riefenstahl was heading toward the eastern watchtower to relieve the night guard, he stumbled upon a prisoner who had collapsed from dysentery in the middle of the yard. The man lay unconscious, surrounded by a pool of excrement. Riefenstahl shouted orders. Other guards came running. A tense confusion followed, rapid arguments about what to do with the body. The distraction lasted 11 minutes, 4 longer than Morel had calculated as the absolute limit. It was enough. Zelda cut the wire with practiced hands, working blind, recognizing the metal by touch alone. Morel signaled the path toward the drainage ditch with silent gestures. Brina crawled first, the thinnest, the least likely to get stuck. Anya followed, her weakened body protesting every movement. Then came Zelda, stronger, heavier, but agile. Morel stayed for last. She was halfway through, sliding beneath the wire, filthy snow clinging to her clothes, when a German boot slammed brutally into her back. Riefenstahl had seen her, not from a distance, but from barely 3 meters away. He had finished dealing with the dead prisoner and was returning to his patrol when he noticed movement in the half-light. Zelda and Brina froze on the far side of the wire, staring back with eyes wide in terror. Anya screamed in Yiddish, a desperate command that escaped before she could think. Run. Run now. And she ran. She ran without looking back, without knowing if the others were following, without knowing if bullets would reach her in the next second. She ran across the open space between the fence and the tree line, legs shaking, lungs burning. She ran over frozen mud that threatened to send her crashing down with every step. She ran toward the promised darkness of the forest as German shouts rose behind her. She heard gunshots, 3, 4, maybe 5. She heard a scream that might have been Brina's, then silence, and she kept running. She didn't know it then. Months later, through fragmented news from other survivors, she learned the truth. Morel Hofstadter was captured that night and executed at dawn in front of the barrack as a warning. Her body was left hanging for 2 days. Brina Aschenberg escaped at first, but froze to death 3 days later, just 2 kilometers from the camp, curled beneath a pine tree as snow slowly buried her. Zelda Kurzbaum survived. She was found weeks later by another partisan group, though she never fully regained the use of her right hand after her fingers froze. Anya ran alone for 4 hours, until her body simply stopped responding, until her legs refused to obey, and she collapsed among the exposed roots of a massive fir tree. Her feet were shredded, skin torn away by branches and stones. Her hands were frozen, blue, numb. Fever burned so high that the world flickered between reality and hallucination, and she carried the painful certainty that she had left everything behind, including the only friends she had left. She woke with a rifle pointed straight at her forehead. It was now 6:42 on February 20th, 1943. The sun was just beginning to filter through the pine tops, spilling a grayish light over snow-laden branches. Anya opened her eyes with effort and saw 5 hardened faces staring down at her with a mixture of curiosity and absolute hostility. filthy beards, skin scarred by cold and hunger, eyes that had seen too much, hands holding weapons with the ease of people who lived with them every day. One of them, a man around 31 with a thick beard and gray eyes that might have been kind in another life, spoke in Russian, his accent unmistakably military. "Who are you? Where do you come from?" one of them asked. Anya, her voice torn apart by thirst and fever, answered in the same language, with a clumsy but understandable accent. "Anya Kovalenko, Jewish. I escaped from a Nazi camp. Lager Ost 17, please don't kill me." The man exchanged a quick glance with the others. His face revealed nothing. "My name is Leonid Karasev," he said at last, "and I'm not going to promise you anything yet." Leonid Karasev was the group's guide, a former Red Army soldier, someone who had chosen resistance over surrender. At his side stood Valeska Orlovets, a 23-year-old Belarusian partisan, an expert marksman. She was thin, with dark eyes that didn't blink when she aimed. She spoke little, and when she did, it was blunt. She could be a German spy. The Nazis infiltrate people all the time. Leonid nodded slowly. "It's possible. She's wearing prisoner clothing, but that can be faked." Anya tried to sit up. Her body refused. Then a woman of about 27 stepped forward. Melania Drubataya, a clandestine nurse who had worked in a rural hospital before the war. She examined Anya's wounds with quick, precise movements. "She has typhus," Melania said. "Severe hypothermia, frostbitten feet, advanced malnutrition. If she's a spy, she's the worst spy in the world." Valeska didn't look convinced. "All the better," she muttered. The fourth member was Evgeny Tarkovsky, 36, in charge of logistics, a former railway engineer with a strategic mind. He watched Anya in silence for several minutes before speaking. "If she really comes from Lager Ost 17, she could have useful information, schedules, routes, structures. We can verify her story." Leonid frowned. "And if she's lying, we kill her. But first let Melania treat her. We lose nothing." For 3 days, Anya drifted in and out of consciousness inside an improvised cave the group used as a temporary shelter. A natural hollow widened with shovels and camouflaged from above with branches and snow. Melania cared for her with an extraordinary patience that clashed brutally with the violence of their world. She cleaned Anya's wounds with boiled water and rags that had once been German uniforms, wrapped her feet in bandages made from torn fabric, and fed her hot soup prepared from edible forest roots and rabbit meat caught in traps. Valeska watched her constantly, seated near the entrance with a rifle resting across her lap, distrust intact in every glance. Leonid questioned Anya gently during moments of clarity. Names of guards, the layout of the barracks, shift schedules, details only someone who had been inside could know. On the 4th day, Anya could speak clearly. The fever had broken. The delirium had receded. She sat near the small fire at the back of the cave, just enough to keep them from freezing, never enough to produce detectable smoke. When Leonid asked the key question, designed to catch lies, "If you were really in that camp, tell me something only someone inside would know. How many floodlights are there on the northern perimeter, and how are they positioned?" Anya answered without hesitation, her voice still weak but steady. "There are 4 floodlights on the northern perimeter, 2 fixed on the east and west guard towers, and 2 mobile ones that sweep the space between them every 90 seconds. The electrical wiring runs along the roof of the carpentry workshop. It's visible from the yard during the day. I saw it when technicians repaired a short circuit 2 weeks ago." Evgeny exchanged a look with Leonid. The information matched exactly what he had observed from outside, and the detail about the wiring, impossible to see at a distance, confirmed she had been inside. Valeska lowered her rifle for the first time, though her expression remained hard. "All right," Leonid said. "You can stay with us, but if you betray us in any way, not even Melania will be able to save you. Do you understand?" Anya nodded in silence. "I understand," Anya said, "and I won't betray you, because now you are all I have." And she didn't. In the days that followed, she did something even more valuable. She made herself indispensable. By mid-March 1943, the Partisan group was facing a critical dilemma. Evgeny's improvised radio equipment had intercepted fragments of a German transmission about a convoy transporting prisoners eastward, very likely toward extermination camps in Poland. The convoy would pass along a secondary road barely 12 kilometers from their current position. It was a rare opportunity for a rescue, but also a potential trap. After several successful attacks in February, German security in the region had been drastically reinforced. They needed precise intelligence on how those convoys operated. Anya had it. She described in meticulous detail the internal communication structure of Lager Ost 17, how officers coordinated transfers, which radio codes they used, which vehicles were assigned specifically for prisoner transport, and which were reserved for supplies. "Prisoner transport trucks are almost always escorted by 2 motorcycles," she explained, drawing in the dirt with a stick. "One in front, one in back, at least on secondary routes considered safe. Sometimes only one, depending on the number of prisoners and the risk assessment of the officer in charge." Evgeny absorbed every word, committing the details to memory. Leonid listened with growing focus, fully aware of the value of such concrete information. And Valeska, for the first time since Anya's arrival, nodded with something that bordered on respect. "We can use that," she said simply. The plan was simple in concept and deadly in execution. Set up an ambush on a tight curve where the secondary road cut through dense forest. Block the way with fallen logs made to look natural. Neutralize the guards. Free the prisoners before they could radio for reinforcements. Everything had to happen in under 3 minutes. Any delay meant reinforcements and death. On March 22, 1943, at 14:37 sharp, the German convoy entered the prepared curve. The group was in position. Leonid on the left flank with 2 partisans, hidden behind a natural embankment. Valeska in an elevated position, perched on a thick branch of a massive pine, rifle trained on the cab of the lead truck. Evgeny covering the rear with 2 fighters armed with captured rifles. Melania with her scant medical supplies, fully aware there would be wounded. And Anya, still weak, but absolutely resolved, hidden in the brush with a Luger pistol stolen weeks earlier from a dead German soldier. She barely knew how to use it. She was willing to learn right then. The first log fell exactly where it needed to. The truck's brakes shrieked violently. The vehicle skidded, then stopped. The motorcycles tried to maneuver, but the space was too narrow. Valeska fired. The first shot shattered the windshield and killed the driver instantly. Leonid threw an improvised grenade, explosives packed inside a metal can, which detonated beneath the second vehicle and lifted it off the ground. 3 guards jumped from the prisoner truck and opened fire immediately. Bullets whistled through the trees. One grazed Leonid's shoulder, tearing a cry of pain from him. Another slammed into a tree trunk centimeters from Anya's face, spraying her with splinters. Chaos reigned for exactly 142 seconds. When silence returned to the forest, A heavy silence, saturated with gunpowder and death. 5 German guards lay dead or critically wounded. The convoy had been completely neutralized. The prisoner truck, its rear door forced open, revealed its human cargo. 23 prisoners, 17 men and 6 women, all suffering varying degrees of starvation and illness, were freed. Anya helped them down one by one, holding trembling hands, speaking in Yiddish and Polish, calming people who no longer knew whether reality itself could be trusted again. Among those freed was an older woman, perhaps 50, though she looked closer to 70. So emaciated she seemed like a skeleton in motion, her gaze completely empty. When Anya offered her water from her canteen, the woman stared without understanding, as if water were a forgotten concept. Then she murmured in Yiddish, "Are you Jewish?" Anya nodded, tears burning her eyes. "Yes, I'm Jewish. Are you safe now?" The woman broke down. Tears carved deep tracks down her face. My daughter was named Anya. She died in the ghetto. She was your age." That night, as the Partisan group regrouped in a new shelter farther north and moved constantly to avoid being tracked, Valeska approached Anya for the first time without hardness in her eyes. She sat beside her near the small fire and said simply, "You did well today. Thank you." It was the first time Valeska spoke to her as an equal, as a comrade. In the months that followed, March, April, May, and June of 1943, Anya took part in 7 more operations. Not as a traditional fighter, she was still too weak to carry heavy weapons and too inexperienced for direct combat. But she became a strategist, a translator when German documents were intercepted, an analyst when patterns in enemy operations needed to be deciphered. Her knowledge of the inner workings of Nazi camps proved invaluable. Evgeny consulted her before every operation involving German installations. Leonid trusted her judgment on timing and risk. Melania treated her like a sister, sharing scarce medical supplies and late-night conversations about what they would do when the war ended. If it ended, if they survived. Even Valeska, the hardest to convince, eventually accepted what everyone already knew. Anya Kovalenko had not only survived, she had chosen to fight. In November 1943, the group carried out its boldest operation to date, sabotaging a German fuel depot on the outskirts of Minsk. The facility stored thousands of liters of gasoline and diesel for Wehrmacht vehicles, a target of immense value and enormous risk, with constant surveillance, regular patrols, and alarm systems. The mission succeeded. The depot burned for 3 days, depriving German forces of critical fuel during the Soviet winter counteroffensive. But Leonid was gravely wounded during the retreat. An undetected German patrol opened fire, and a bullet tore through his left lung. For 3 terrible weeks, Melania fought to keep him alive as the group moved constantly to avoid reprisals, without antibiotics or proper surgical instruments, relying only on basic medical knowledge, iron will, and the silent prayers of those around him. Anya cared for Leonid during that time, sitting beside him in the darkness of improvised caves, reading softly from a book of Russian poetry Evgeny had found in an abandoned house. Verses by Pushkin and Lermontov, words about love, death, honor, and loss that seemed written for that exact moment. When Leonid recovered enough to speak without choking, his voice still weak and his lung permanently damaged, he said to Anya as she changed his bandages, "You're stronger than you think, and braver than you're willing to admit. Don't forget that when all this is over." The winter of 1943-1944 was brutal beyond human description. Temperatures plunged to -32 degrees for weeks at a time. Food grew so scarce that some days they survived on boiled tree bark and snow. Several members of the group died, not from German bullets, but from freezing, pneumonia, or simple starvation. But Anya Kovalenko survived, not by luck, not by miracle, but by a will that was pure, stubborn, and impossible to break. In June 1944, when the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, the massive offensive that would liberate Belarus and begin the systematic reconquest of occupied territory, Leonid Karasev's Partisan group was contacted by regular Soviet forces and formally integrated into coordinated military operations. Anya was officially registered as a partisan combatant with the rank of intelligence analyst and received military documentation certifying her participation in 19 operations against German occupation forces between February 1943 and June 1944. The exact number of lives saved because of her work was never calculated with precision, but Soviet records explicitly mention at least 67 prisoners rescued directly in actions where participant Kovalenko provided crucial intelligence, along with many more freed in operations enabled by her analysis of enemy structures. When the war ended in May 1945, when the guns fell silent, the smoke cleared, and Europe began the slow, painful counting of its dead, Anya weighed 41 kilograms. She carried deep scars on her feet, her hands, her back. She had nightmares every night and memories that could never be erased. But she was alive, and she was completely alone. Leonid Karasev had been killed in a German bombardment in January 1945, just 4 months before the war's end. An artillery shell struck directly where he was coordinating an attack. There was no body to bury. Valeska Orlovets disappeared after the war, most likely arrested and executed by Soviet authorities during the post-war purges, when Stalin viewed independently operating partisans with suspicion and treated them as potential dissidents. Melania Drubataya returned to her native village in Belarus, but was never allowed to practice officially as a nurse. Authorities considered her suspect for having worked underground without party supervision. Evgeny Tarkovsky moved to Moscow and returned to work as a railway engineer. He never spoke publicly about the war and carried his memories in silence until his death in 1972. Anya wandered across Central Europe for 8 months after the conflict ended, moving from refugee camp to refugee camp, desperately searching for any member of her family. She looked for her mother, Chava, for her brothers, David and Samuel, for her sister, Rachel. She scanned survivor lists, spoke with Jewish aid organizations, with other refugees who had passed through the same camps, the same transports. She found no one. They were all dead. Her entire family had been erased from the world. In January 1946, she arrived in Geneva, Switzerland, and there, inside a small office of a humanitarian organization on Rue Durand, she met Abelin Kornitzer, a 41-year-old Jewish lawyer who had survived by taking refuge in Switzerland in 1939. Abelin had fled Austria shortly before the borders closed completely, leaving behind her parents, who refused to escape and whom she never saw again. She was an active member of international organizations dedicated to documenting war crimes and supporting Holocaust survivors. When Abelin heard Anya's full story, the camp, the brutal escape, the partisans, the rescue operations, the years of fighting, she looked at her with an intensity Anya had not seen since her time with Leonid. She told her that she had intelligence, courage, and something even rarer, memory of what happened when the world looked away, and that the world urgently needed people like her in courtrooms, not only as witnesses who tell what was done to them, but as advocates capable of building cases and demanding justice. She asked her a simple question. Have you ever thought about studying law? Anya had thought of nothing beyond staying alive. But those words planted a seed. and Abelin helped her apply for a scholarship program created specifically for survivors of the Holocaust. Anya Kovalenko was accepted into the University of Geneva in September 1946. She studied law for 5 years, with an almost obsessive focus, not out of personal ambition, but for something deeper. For every person who had died without justice. She graduated with honors in 1951 and began working as a legal assistant on cases involving crimes against humanity. In 1961, she became part of the International Documentation and Analysis Team at the Jerusalem trials, where Adolf Eichmann was prosecuted for crimes against humanity. There, she testified about the operational structures of Nazi transit camps and the systematic bureaucratic complicity behind the Holocaust. Her testimony lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. She spoke in 5 languages when documents required it. She cited full names, exact dates, precise figures. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not allow emotion to blur the facts. She spoke with the ruthless precision of someone who had seen hell with open eyes and chosen to record it so it could never be denied. In 1973, she received an official recognition from the State of Israel for her tireless legal defense of survivors and for her documented participation in the resistance during the war. The ceremony was brief and restrained, held in a government hall in Jerusalem. Anya did not give a long speech. When asked for a few words, she stood, looked at the small audience, and said only this: "This is not for me. It is for Brina Aschenberg, who froze to death at 16. For Mirel Hofstadter, executed for trying to be free. For Zelda Kirsbaum, who survived but lost her hands. For Leonid Karasev, Valeska Orlovets, Melania Drubataya, Evgeny Tarkovsky, and for all those who did not live to see this day. For every name history tried to erase. For every life silence tried to consume." Anya Kovalenko died on April 12, 1998 in Geneva at the age of 73. She never married and never had children. She devoted her entire life to legally defending those without a voice, to building cases against perpetrators of crimes against humanity, and to documenting, almost obsessively, what the world preferred to forget. In her will, she donated all her personal archives, journals written in worn notebooks, official documents, maps drawn from memory, testimonies recorded on tape, to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Among those papers was a letter written in 1946, shortly after meeting Abelin Kornitzer. It was never sent. It was addressed simply to whoever finds this someday. She wrote that she did not know whether anyone would remember what happened in those frozen forests, or whether her struggle would matter in 50 or 100 years. But she was certain of one thing: every life saved, every operation completed, every night survived had been a silent victory against oblivion. They did not fight to become heroes with medals and monuments. They fought to remain human in a world trying to turn them into numbers and ashes. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. The legacy of Anya Kovalenko is not carved in marble or engraved on golden plaques. It lives in the dusty archives of international courts, in yellowed trial records almost no one remembers anymore, and in the testimonies of survivors she represented for decades with quiet dedication. It lives in the 67 lives she helped rescue directly during the war, and in the countless others she saved indirectly through her intelligence, her precise analysis, her prodigious memory, and her unbreakable courage. It lives in the deep silence of the Belarusian forests, where she fell twice and rose twice, where she fled death, learned to fight, lost friends, and found purpose, where she stopped being only a victim. And it lives in the lingering echo of a question she wrote in her final diary, dated March 1997, just 1 year before her death. What truly defines a hero? The visible size of the victory, or the invisible depth of resistance? Public recognition with fanfare, or private conviction that needs no witnesses? I fell into hell twice, she wrote. Once in a Nazi camp, when fate threw me against the wire, and once in a partisan perimeter, when I escaped only to face more suspicion. And twice I got up, not because I was brave by nature, not because I had anything special, but because I refused to stay down. Because I chose to make every day of life an act of resistance against those who wanted me to disappear. And in the end, that choice was the only victory that truly mattered. If you know someone in your city or country whose story deserves to be told, write it down. Perhaps the next invisible hero is yours, and as long as someone remembers, no one is ever truly forgotten.